Hello everybody, I'm sorry, this is News Reporter Jack reporting to you live from Harlem, New York with the news. And today, we got to rebuild. That's right, we have to rebuild, and I'm not too sure what we are rebuilding. Do you know? Oh, I see. You don't know. Well, why don't you know? Oh, I'm sorry, everyone. I get a little excited about the news, but today we are here in Harlem, New York, about to build something. I'm not too sure. I have Clark the Squirrel here with me, and we're going to find out just what's going on. I'm sorry, everyone. So let's go out there and rebuild. Remember, we got to rebuild. Hello everybody, this is Youth Pastor Emmanuel, and as always, News Reporter Jack always forgets to tell you about me. Yeah, you about me. Anyway, today we're going to be reading from Isaiah 61 verses 1 through 3. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about our story today. We're going to learn about the Reconstruction era, which took place just after the Civil War. And it's very important because this whole era, or this whole period, actually will define the direction of the United States. But a lot of slaves got free, and they were happy they were free. They wanted to live their own lives, and they no longer had to live under the oppression of slavery. A lot of soldiers died. Basically, soldiers fought to keep the Union together, but a lot of soldiers died, and I want to tell you about Isaiah 61. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn and provide those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. They will be called oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord for the display of His splendor. Now this chapter is there's a lot that you could say there, but a lot of slaves were free. They were free to pursue their own lives. Now, they didn't know at that time that their freedom would come with a tremendous cost. But the white Northerners wanted to make everything right, and they wanted to give them a brand new start. Now, when we look at this chapter that we just read in Isaiah 61, it was actually when, to let you know, the Jews had just returned to Jerusalem after they had been in captive and by the Babylonians, and their whole capital was in ruins, just like the South was in ruins. But this time, they had a chance to rebuild and have a brand new start at things. But this rebuilding process was going to be hard and long. Just like for African Americans, it was hard and long. Now, this chapter in Isaiah, it also was they were faced with the hard task of, like I said, rebuilding after destruction. God was informing them, even though the city was destroyed, He would comfort them, and His encouragement was that they could rebuild, and that he would exchange all of their mourning for seeing how their city was destroyed. He would exchange all their mourning for gladness or joy. So that's what he stated he would do. And God wanted them to rejoice because they had a brand new sense of, a brand new freedom that they didn't have before, that they had to rebuild. Rebuilding is very hard, everybody, because you have to clear out the ashes and all the destruction, and then you have to start all over again. And that's what they had to do in Jerusalem. But today, we're going to learn about African Americans who have to rebuild their lives and start all over again as free people. So let's see what happens to them during something called the Reconstruction era. I think it's going to be nice. Don't you?
I know what you're thinking. Yeah, my room is really messed up. You know why? I'll tell you why. Because Adela Ray and I got into a fight over the Madden football game. And we started throwing things around. Now, we have to stay here and clean it up. Oh, I should have thought of a better plan. Well, look where fighting got us. Now we have to rebuild everything. Oh boy, I wonder, did anybody else have to rebuild anything after fighting? Who knows? This room is really messed up at Delray. Wasn't such a good idea to fight.
Well, this is Mr. Antonio, and I'm down here in the kitchen, and I heard all the fighting upstairs. Oh boy, those guys are really in trouble. It reminds me of the Reconstruction era, or simply called Reconstruction. It was a period in the United States history that followed the American Civil War, and that was from 1861 to 1865, and was dominated by legal, social, and political challenges of the abolition or the abolishment of slavery and federal control over and reintegration of the former Confederate States into the United States. 3 amendments were added to the Constitution to grant citizenship and equal civil rights to the newly freed slaves. To circumvent these former Confederate states imposed things like, in other words, they tried to prevent a lot of freedoms that African Americans gained by doing things like poll tax and illiteracy tests, and they sought to intimidate and control the black population to discourage them from voting. Now, throughout the war, the Union was confronted with the issue of how to administer captured areas and handle slaves escaping to the Union lines. The United States Army played a vital role in establishing a free labor economy in the South, protecting the freedmen's rights, and creating educational and religious institutions. Despite its reluctance to interfere with slavery, Congress passed something called the Confiscation Act to seize Confederate slaves, providing, and this was actually right just before Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. Congress established the Freedmen's Bureau to provide much needed food, shelter to newly freed slaves. As it became clear to the Union that the Union would win, Congress debated the process for readmission of the states that separated themselves from the United States, conditions for readmission, and desirability of social reforms. Now, Lincoln favored something called the 10% plan and vetoed the Wade-Davis bill, which proposed strict conditions on readmission. Lincoln was assassinated, unfortunately, in 1865, just as the fighting was drawing to a close. Now, he was replaced by Andrew Johnson, the vice president, who vetoed radical Republican bills, pardoned Confederate leaders, and allowed Southern states to enact draconian black codes that restricted the rights of freedmen or freed slaves. His actions outraged many Northerners and stoked fears the Southern elite would regain power. Radical Republicans swept into power in 1866 midterm elections, and they gained the majorities in both houses of Congress. That means in the Senate and also in the Congress. In 1867, 1868, the Radical Republicans enacted the Reconstruction Acts over Johnson's veto, setting the terms by which former Confederate states could be readmitted into the Union of the United States. The constitutional conventions, they held those throughout the South. They gave black men the right to vote. New state governments were established by a coalition of the freedmen's, and that they were supportive of white Southerners and Northern transplants. In other words, people from the North went down to the South to buy land and to live there too. They were opposed by the Redeemers, who sought to restore white supremacy and establish the Democratic Party and control of the Southern governments and the Southern society. Now, violent groups including the Ku Klux Klan, the White League, and Red Shirts engaged in paramilitary insurrectionary. Well, they wanted to fight, and they were terrorists too, and that disrupted during the Reconstruction government period and terrorized Republicans. Congressional anger at Johnson's veto of the Radical Republicans' legislation led to his impeachment by the House of Representatives, but he was not convicted by the Senate, and therefore he was not removed from office. Okay? Under President Ulysses Grant, Radical Republicans enacted additional legislation to enforce civil rights for African Americans, such as the Ku Klux Klan Act, which means you couldn't prevent African Americans from voting. And then the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which was the first Civil Rights Act. However, the resistance to Reconstruction by Southern whites and its high cost contributed to a losing support in the North. In 1876, the presidential election was marked by black voter suppression in the South, and the result was close and contested. An electoral commission resulted in the Compromise of 1877, which awarded the election to Republican Rutherford B. Hayes on the understanding that federal troops would cease to play a role in the South. And in other words, they had to send down soldiers to make sure they could enforce the rules so that African Americans wouldn't be discriminated against or terrorized and things like that. Now, Hayes accordingly removed the last federal troops from the South, which historically generally marked the end. That's what some historians say. I almost said theologians. Some historians say that was the end of Reconstruction. And Efforts to enforce federal civil rights in the South ended in 1890 with the failure of the Lodge Bill. Now, I want to let everybody know that the boys were fighting and their room got messed up. Just like the South was destroyed, their room had got destroyed too. So right now, they're trying to straighten it up. Let's see how they're doing right now. Do you think they're getting everything together?
Oh boy, this room is really messed up. And I'm telling you right now, we gotta clean it up. But, you know what? I'm tired of it. I'm really tired of it. Headbutt! Oh, that hurt me. Oh! Gotta do something. Well, I'm hurt. I'll get punished for the headbutt. Oh, boy.
Oh, wow, everybody. I'm so sorry you had to see that fighting. That wasn't good. That wasn't good at all. All that fighting. Well, fighting didn't really solve anything after the Civil War. There still has been racial problems throughout the United States, and even today, there's some battles that are still being fought. Well, I hope they learned something, but more importantly, remember Isaiah 61, verses 1 through 3, where this is the favorable year of the Lord, and it's your favorable year too. And even though the boys have to put the room back together, looks like they can't do it because they're headbutting each other. That's not a good thing. But I want you to know that God wants you, if some things are messed up, He wants you to put your life back together, and He's going to help you too. Okay, guys, I have to go now. I don't want to go to Calvin's house because I don't want to be involved with all that fighting. Do you? Oh, boy.